Well, hey everybody. Welcome to part two of the JFK and Johnson years, the crises JFK faced while in office. President Kennedy got elected in November of 1960 and took office in January of 1961. And while he's in office from January of 61 to November of 1963, that's probably going to be about the height of the Cold War. President Kennedy is going to have three major crises that he faces that challenge his leadership, his ability to guide this country forward, and his resolve to fight communism. Each of these challenges, of course, is going to deal with either the Soviet Union or Cuba or both. And with the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and with Cuba, Fidel Castro. So let's look at these crises and let's see how JFK dealt with them. Fidel Castro had taken over Cuba in the late 1950s after a hard-fought civil war. And when he became the dictator of Cuba, of course, he implemented communism in that beautiful Caribbean island country. Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida. And so, of course, the United States had an interest in what was happening in Cuba. Cuba had been a pretty first world, in a lot of ways, country before communism took over. The Cuban people lived well, and by and large, and there were a lot of Cuban Americans here that still had family and friends in Cuba when communism takes over in the late 50s. Of course, once Castro takes over, he makes it a point to ally himself with the Soviet Union right away, and immediately becomes a pain in the neck for American leaders. But in the late 50s, when he takes over, President Eisenhower is in office at the time, and Eisenhower and the U.S. government had a plan to remove Castro from Cuba and eliminate him from his communist dictator seat that he enjoyed. The question is, when JFK took over, would he agree to follow through with this plan and try to get Castro out of power? The answer is coming up. Well, in case you didn't guess, or maybe you did, the answer is yes. JFK agrees to continue a plan that the Eisenhower administration had hatched. The plan is for the American CIA to train Cubans who are disaffectioned with Castro and Cuba, to arm them with American weapons and to have them invade their home country of Cuba, defeat the Cuban army, and defeat Castro. The plan also is for American air power to go over and help decimate the Cuban army and for the American military to be involved. And so Kennedy decided that he would go forward with this plan. Of course, it's supposed to be top secret. And it's going to get Castro out of power and restore Cuba, to freedom and opportunity and capitalism. And that's the idea. Well, upon the advice of his Joint Chiefs of Staff and CIA leadership and so forth, Kennedy decides to go ahead with this, and it happens on April 17th, 1961. The Cubans who had been trained by the U.S. and armed by the U.S. Tried to land in their home country of Cuba, and the operation is a complete disaster. 114 of the Cubans trained by the CIA are killed in this operation. Over 1,100 are captured and placed in a prison camp. And what is supposed to be a secret operation, of course, is not so secret when people start finding out about it. And this makes the U.S. and President Kennedy look terrible. So this is a major defeat for the United States. Castro remains in power, more defiant than ever now toward the United States, and Kennedy looks really bad. And so this first crisis goes down as a defeat for the Kennedy administration and for the United States. Seeing that the United States is wounded, no one takes greater pleasure in it than Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. He, of course, also is going to clash with Kennedy numerous times in the early 1960s. But he sees this Bay of Pigs disaster and he loves it. He now sees an opportunity to do something else to jab Kennedy and kick him while he's down. And that thing is building the Berlin Wall. For years since World War II got over, the Russians, of course, controlled East Germany and East Berlin, while the Americans, French, and British controlled West Germany and West Berlin. And the Americans and British and French had set up a system of relative freedom and decency for the people that they had jurisdiction over, while the Soviets were brutal to the East Germans and the East Berliners. And so a lot of the East Germans and East Berliners tried to get out and go to the West, West Germany or West Berlin, for freedom and opportunity. And finally, in 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, this is late summer of 1961, Nikita Khrushchev surprises everybody. And the Soviets basically overnight build a wall down the center of the city, dividing East from West. This wall will be patrolled by armed Russian guards with their guns, and it will be topped with barbed wire in many places and so forth. And basically people that were separated from their family or friends one night, being either in East or West Berlin, the next morning wake up and are permanently separated. Families and friends will not see each other again for 30 years. The Berlin Wall goes up in 1961, will not come down officially until 1991. And so this is another slap in the face to Kennedy on Khrushchev's part, and Khrushchev wants to show us who's boss. This is a symbol of the Cold War struggle. It's a symbol of the Russians trying to play tough, and this has to go down as really another defeat for Kennedy and the Americans. So JFK really needs something to redeem him. He needs something to work out. And ironically, it comes from the time during the Cold War where we were probably closest to World War III. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurs in 1962, as you can see from the map, and it's basically known as the 14 Days in October. But they made a movie about this called 13 Days in October, but the picture there says 14 days. But basically for 2 weeks in October into November of 1962, the Americans and the Soviets come within an eyelash, it seemed, of launching nuclear weapons at each other and starting World War III. The United States had discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962. And of course, Kennedy and his administration are alarmed. This is what we feared most. This is what we didn't want to happen. And so with the Soviet missiles in Cuba pointed at the U.S., this is an imminent threat and poses danger for potentially all Americans. And so JFK orders the military to be ready to go at a moment's notice. What we do is we put a blockade, our Navy puts a blockade around Cuba. We let Khrushchev know that we've found his missiles in Cuba. They're pointed at us, we know that. And we demand that he remove the missiles. Well, for 2 weeks, basically, he and Kennedy bargain and argue and fight and go back and forth over what's going to happen with these missiles. Who's going to stand down first? Who's going to back down first? And neither guy wants to give an inch. They each want to show their superiority. And so finally, after 2 weeks of this, the world on edge, waiting for missiles to be launched, both sides agree to certain terms. And this after Soviet ships a few times approached the blockade, and we told them, if your ships go past the blockade, well, that's a symbol of war. And they approached the blockade and at the last minute turn around. And so after 2 weeks of near World War III, we avoid the war when both sides agree to certain things. This has to be seen for Kennedy as a win, and he badly needed that after the Bay of Pigs disaster and the Berlin Wall going up. And so these three crises, the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, will come to define JFK's time in office, will come to define how the world and how the American nation sees him as a leader. And so, boy, I'm glad I didn't have to make these decisions that he did, or have to go through what he did. But he had to deal with some very difficult times while in office. And that'll be a wrap for part 2 of the JFK and Johnson years.